Now to the crackdown on history itself, from removing museum exhibits on American slavery to paintings over Washington, D.C.'s Black Lives Matter mural. Scholars and activists say Trump's DEI purge is minimizing and even erasing Black history. And our next guest is acutely aware of the impact. Monroe Nichols is mayor of Tulsa, Oklahoma. His new initiative, Road to Repair, would grant the city's Black community over $100 million to address harms caused by the Tulsa race massacre of 1921. And Mayor Nichols joins Michelle Martin to discuss the importance of confronting the country's past.
Thanks, Christiane. Mayor Nichols, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
So before we get into the details of the project that you're trying to, the effort that you're making in Tulsa, I just wanted to kind of take you back a little bit. You were actually born in Waco, Texas. Yeah. You moved to Oklahoma to go to college and also to play football, but mainly to go to college.
Right.
I just wanted to ask you if you remember when you heard about the Tulsa race massacre, because this was an historical event that for some people, clearly not for survivors and the people who lived through it, but for many people had been kind of lost to history. Will you tell people who may not have heard of this what happened? And I'm particularly interested in what you first heard had happened versus what you learned later.
Yeah, I mean, what I first heard had happened is just that there's this riot in Tulsa where Black Wall Street was destroyed. That was like the basis of the knowledge, right? And so I didn't have much beyond that. But for the people who were watching, what existed in Tulsa at one time was an entrepreneurial center. It was almost like a city within a city, where you had movie theaters and grocery stores and doctors' offices and attorneys' offices and schools and churches that all thrived in what was a very segregated society here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood District would become known as Black Wall Street because of all the commerce in and out of this part of our community. On May 31st and June 1st, a 24-hour period saw a massacre that saw a white mob come to Greenwood and burn to the ground about 37 blocks, about 1,200 Black businesses and homes, and left thousands of people homeless and some even put into camps. The death toll is believed to be over 300, although only reported as 36 at the time by local officials. And it is the only documented aerial assault on an American city in our nation's history. So it was a massacre of epic proportions, and it destroyed what was perhaps the greatest example of Black excellence in economics and entrepreneurship that the country had seen at the time, and that's what happened in that 24-hour period from May 31st to June 1st.
The only sort of minor edit I would make to that is people may remember that there was a neighborhood in Philadelphia that was also bombed by government officials. There was a sort of a Black radical group that had kind of taken up residence there, but that is also seen as a modern atrocity. But here's the other thing: you said you had initially heard of this as a riot. And it has now been known as a massacre. And there's a real reason that matters. Could you just explain why that matters so much? Then it's not just a matter of words, that the nomenclature is not just a matter of which word. It has real force.
Absolutely. It has real force. And it was in some ways a matter of legality. A riot meant that it was easier to deny insurance claims for folks who had lost homes and businesses. And honestly had a lot of people escape any level of culpability. To this day, not one person went to jail because of, their involvement. Until this day, not one government has repaid back to help rebuild in ways that were directly associated with bringing back what was lost. There were promises made to do that even directly after the massacre. Did not happen. So naming it a riot all these years meant that there's a lot of people who got to escape culpability, both on the individual side and the public institutional side. And it wasn't until, more about this came out that it was clear this was not a riot. This was a slaughtering of a people, because we now know the numbers. We now know what was lost. We know now what was refused to be restored, for example. It was certainly a massacre of epic proportions. And to your point about Philadelphia and other places, I think the other great thing about uncovering our history is that we know about other places where things like this happen, maybe not at the same scale where you have 300 dead, but Wilmington, North Carolina is another example of a place where this stuff happened. And I think it's important that as we consider what we're doing with the Greenwood Trust, that we find good models for how you begin to mitigate the harm, because it exists. The legacy of the massacre is very palpable in Tulsa. It doesn't mean that people don't like each other and we have that, but there's this subtleness about it that still has this community kind of held by the chains of division in ways that just prevent you from uniting in the way that you need to unite to meet the other big challenges that we face, that everybody faces together. And so I do think it's really important, even in this moment in our nation's history, that we're very honest about the road that it's taken to get here, and that we find ways to mitigate harm, because that's the only way that I think we can appropriately move forward.
So let's bring up to the present moment. There was a lot of attention paid to the Tulsa Race Massacre on the centennial of it back in 2021, which acknowledged the 100 years after. There are still some people who survived, who were obviously very small children, at the time. There was a lot of energy around trying to figure out, what to do, but not a lot really happened. I mean, there were negotiations around some kind of recompense. Didn't happen. Now we're 3 years later, and you've announced a major initiative to kind of, I don't know, maybe I'll let you describe it, because it's a very comprehensive project. What is it that you have in mind?
Yeah. So just for a little bit of context, you mentioned the centennial back in 2021, and going all the way back to 2001, there was a state commission that recommended certain things the state should do to address the harm caused by the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Since then, we've had a commission of Beyond the Apology Commission that was created by my predecessor to come up with recommendations. We have advocacy groups like Justice for Greenwood and the Deep Greenwood Foundation. Where I arrived at was the creation of the Greenwood Trust, a private charitable trust that I'm going to be going out and raising capital for, $105 million, reflective of the very specific $24 million recommendation from the Beyond the Apology Commission, which is made up of descendants around housing and home ownership, a $60 million fund investing directly into cultural landmarks and the surviving entities from the massacre. There are some buildings that still stand. So making sure that we're investing in those, because they're not always in the best condition for all the reasons that we know that happens over time. And then also invest in the future by investing in college scholarships and business grants and no interest loans to businesses that are owned by descendants, so that in the end, not only are we mitigating harm, but we're ensuring that we can begin to have those same families, those descendants, rebuild the district back to where it was. So
there's a couple of things here. This really depends on raising a lot of private money. You really think you can do it?
Absolutely. I think we can do it. We've had some conversations up here. We're spending a year really planning to set the programs, to, appoint trustees, a board of directors that'll be national and local. And then we're also evaluating what public assets we have that the trust can be a beneficiary of. So there's parts of the Greenwood district that the city owns land in. And as we develop, the proceeds from those developments can go back into the trust. I think there's two things that you have to balance when you think about the political realities of where you're at. So you got one school of folks who say, well, the massacre was a long time ago. I didn't do anything wrong. Why should I have to pay for it? Right? You got that going. Then you got some people even on the other side who said, well, 104 years later, we really need direct cash payment. So you're balancing these two things. And so the thought is, what do we have in the way of assets that when developed can produce to feed into the trust? So there's obviously some skin in the game from the public side. But the idea is, if we can create the kind of economic activity with those assets, with private capital, we can get to a space where those folks who are of the school of thought who believe that they shouldn't pay, understood, that's fine. We don't have to fight about that. We're going to make investments. We're going to do it both privately, and we're going to do it through the way of using some public assets. So
you were first elected in 2024, as I understand.
Yeah.
You just took office in 2024.
Just took office in December.
And I want to say you're also the first Black mayor, of Tulsa. And is that why you ran, in part to achieve something like this, to create this kind of energy around it?
It actually wasn't. I mean, I ran, so our city is dealing with a number of challenges. I ran on ending homelessness in 6 years, improving student outcomes, expanding our economy, making Tulsa the safest big city in the country, and working with tribal nations. Tulsa is also the largest city in the country that's all Indian reservation. That was my focus during the campaign. But about 10 days after I got elected, all these recommendations on how you mitigate harm hit your desk. And you have a decision to make. Are you going to ignore them? Are you going to put them aside and say these things aren't possible? Are you going to lean into it? And my sense is that the four things that I mentioned for the reasons that I ran for mayor, I don't think they're possible unless you do this. Communities who are divided or who have this unresolved trauma have a hard time meeting the need on all these other big challenges that we have. I think we see this all across the country. So the Greenwood Trust, although very much focused on the descendant community and mitigating harm, I think it's critical to meeting all those other goals, which are the reasons I ran for office.
In fact, you said that in the speech that you gave announcing the trust, or your sort of plans for the trust. You said there is not one Tulsan, regardless of their skin color, who wouldn't be better off today had the massacre not happened, or if generations before had done the work to restore what was lost. Will you say more about that?
I think we would have been the exception to some of those things you see all across the country. Not every place had a Greenwood district, right? Not every place had that kind of example at that kind of scale of where folks had beaten the odds, even in a segregated society. So imagine if that had gone uninterrupted, what it would look like today. Imagine the number of African Americans all across this country now who have some origins of Tulsa who would have stayed here, but who left after the massacre. Imagine all those who would have been drawn here because of the economic vitality of this community. And imagine what it would have meant for our city's economy overall. We would have been in some ways the exception of a lot of places all across the country. And so I say because of the massacre, because we had the Greenwood district, it certainly should reinforce to us that our problems from an economic standpoint were man-made, brought on by the massacre in a lot of ways, right? We had the opportunity to close the wealth gap had the massacre never happened. We had the opportunity to close the achievement gap had the massacre never happened. And we traded that. We traded that opportunity to be that shining example of how a city can thrive for everybody on May 31st and June 1st of 1921. And I still do believe it, that there's not one person in the city who wouldn't be better off had that not happened.
Well, it's interesting because the pretext for the massacre was, like so many other instances of violence directed at Black people, was an incident where it was alleged that, a white woman was mistreated. Okay. But in the sort of the light of history, the argument has subsequently, some people would argue that the reason that this violence took on this kind of vicious mass quality was jealousy. It was economic jealousy. That there was a certain cohort of people who couldn't tolerate the fact that Black people in Greenwood were as successful as they were. Those folks have descendants too. And so the question becomes, do you think you can persuade those descendants that all these years later, even they will be better off if these initiatives take place?
Oh, absolutely. I think I would tell the folks who descend from those families who were more the perpetrator side of the massacre, that they would have benefited a great deal. They wouldn't have the legacy of something so horrible as a stain on their family's history. They could talk about openly their family's history with pride. And I think that's something that was also taken from those families. And so I believe that Tulsa is a much different place. I know Tulsa is a much different place in 2025 than it was in 1921. And I think that's the message right now, right? Like, we are not that far removed from the massacre in a lot of ways. There's still two survivors that live today. I just visited Mother Fletcher and Mother Randall last Wednesday. Mother Fletcher is very sharp. She's 111 years old, but she is here. Sometimes I think we think about history when you see black and white pictures and you think, oh my goodness, that was such a long time ago. It wasn't that long ago, right? when we think about the overarching kind of context of history. And so, yeah, I would absolutely tell those folks they more so than almost anybody would be better off had the massacre not happen. But I think it also should reinforce in them this need to do something about it, right? I think when I think about restoration and righteousness, it's also about getting right with that family history that those folks might have. I don't blame them no more than I blame anybody else. So it's not a question of blame, but it is a question of courage. Do we have the courage to do something that's difficult to do at a time where it's difficult to do it? Do we have the courage to cross the train tracks and talk about the lived experience of our neighbors in a way that we haven't done before? Because I think when you do that, it makes the Greenwood Trust a very easy sell, right? When you just begin to bind those old wounds, it makes stuff incredibly easy.
Mayor, before we let you go, this initiative arrives at a very interesting time when some people would call this a backlash moment to these kinds of initiatives. Do you see headwinds at this point?
Significant headwinds, but so much of that is less about the national context, because we've had times where one could argue it would have been a better time to have a conversation like this, but it didn't happen then either. So there's never really a right time that we found in 104 years to have this conversation. So I think you just got to meet it with a whole lot of honesty and transparency and not be afraid to talk about it in certain spaces. Again, and I said this in the speech last Sunday, this is not an effort to assign blame. This is an effort to address the harm caused by an event that is a historical fact. And that's the reason why we released the 45,000 pages of unreleased documents that we're sitting on. That's why we continue the Graves investigation, because families deserve closure. And I think everybody can understand that. This is not about going and saying, oh, look how evil certain people are in this community. It's just like, no, people just need closure to know what happened to their loved one. Even in a moment like this, think about the opportunity for us, while everybody's having a much different conversation about race. Imagine if Tulsa, all of us came together and we made this happen. Just like I said, we would have been an outlier had the Greenwood district remained uninterrupted. We would also be an outlier nationally of how people who are all political strides, all different races, are coming together saying this is in our value set, and we're going to do what we can, even with the constraints that we have, to make these investments. It actually helps us stand out in ways that I want Tulsa to stand out. This gives us the opportunity to make sure that June 1st wasn't the end of the story. We get to write new chapters on it in a way that I think we provide the rest of the country with a pathway with how you can engage these kind of conversations. I think that's an important contribution to make, but it's also about us getting right with ourselves and making sure we can move this community forward as one big united city. And so if we have to take a look back 104 years to think about how we go forward tomorrow, that's an investment of time and effort that's well worth it.
Mr. Mayor, Monroe Nichols IV, the mayor of Tulsa, thank you so much for speaking with us. I do hope we'll speak again. I'd love to hear how it's going.
I can't wait to do that.
Next, we turn to public health, where the Trump administration is taking a shock and awe approach, scrubbing government websites of health information for women and racial minorities, pulling the U.S. out of the World Health Organization, and choosing vaccine critic Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of Health and Human Services. The importance of healthcare is underscored in a new docufilm, The Calling, a medical school journey. It follows the academic and personal stories of students at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. Here's a clip from the trailer.
Growing up here in the Bronx, I passed by Einstein all the time. As I got older, I realized the magnitude of that. I was like, we have a medical school in the Bronx. That's actually pretty cool when you think about it.
When I was 14, I knew I wanted to be a doctor. Every exam you take, every rotation you get through, you know you're one step closer to the dream.
I basically grew up in my parents' clinic in Syria. They were my first inspiration to becoming a doctor. وما كتير سريعة يعني ما ملحق.
First 2 years all about book learning, lectures, and then third year is about rotation, seeing patients.
Lungs sound good.
It's a whole new way of thinking, this whole new language.
Filmmaker Asako Glasgow and Dr. Lishana Finazi, who features in the documentary, joined Hari Srinivasan to discuss what it takes to become a physician in one of America's most underserved neighborhoods.
Biana, thanks. Asako Glasgow, Shauna Finnessy, thanks so much for joining us. Asako, let's start with why this film. You follow a group of students through Einstein College in the Bronx, through kind of their trials and tribulations over a whole year. What drew you to this?
You know, it was something that, especially after the pandemic, I was really, I live in Harlem. I live right next to the Bronx, and I saw how much medical inequity was at the same time that everyone was coming out every night to like bang their pots and pans. I thought, who is becoming doctors today? And, one of the other things that, was very concerning to me was I felt like a lot of the problems and why there was so much inequity was because of doctors coming from, mostly coming from very privileged backgrounds. So it was really important to me to focus on students who came from a really wide range of backgrounds and to see how it affected them to learn medicine in a community like the Bronx, which is one of the most underserved in America.
Shauna, your journey is in the film. I mean, you're one of the few students that are kind of profiled. You grew up sort of in the neighborhood, in Harlem, in the Bronx, and you really kind of take us on a walking tour of some more of the painful parts of your life. And when did you think that you wanted to be a doctor?
Yeah, I wanted to be a doctor when I was 14 years old. It was this kid in my neighborhood. My little brother was 4 at the time. That he was about the same age as my little brother, who had a congenital heart defect. And my mother would go visit him and just talk about all the sick kids at the time. And it just kind of really resonated with me. And I was like, oh, I need to do something about that in my naive 14-year-old way. And it just set me on this path to wanting to be a doctor. And that kind of just ignited that. He ultimately ended up passing due to his disease. But I think at the time, it was something that I thought I wanted to do and wanted to help.
Asako mentioned this about who's becoming doctors. And I wonder, when you are in a medical school class, how conscious of you are about who your peers are, what their life experience is, and what they're going to bring sort of to that examination room?
Yeah, as you know, we're very underrepresented in medicine, being a Black person and being a woman too, is very underrepresented. I think in my class, which is better than most in the country being at Einstein, I was even shocked. I thought going to the Bronx, it would be more diverse because it's local. New York City is a very diverse city, but people all over the country applies to medical schools all over the country. So we were still very much the minority. But I think we did reflect a little bit more than the national average of people of color in med school. So it wasn't a shock to me. Also did not went to a predominantly white college as well. So I was always used to being the only person representing my people in the room. And even that comes with its own burden because I feel like I'm one person. I can't speak for everyone that looks like me or look close to me. So I just felt like when different conversations happen, they look to me in the room and I'm like, I don't have all the answers. I can speak on my own experience, but I don't.
Yeah. Asako, according to the Association of American Medical Colleges, there's an 11.6% drop in Black matriculants, 10.8% drop in Latino matriculants, and also about a 12% drop in just the incoming class. What are some of the factors that explain that?
Well, I mean, I think we all can see in the news, there's been a very concerted attack on, affirmative action and educational equity pretty much ever since the civil rights movement. And, the very first attempt to have, affirmative action for medical, or in that case, dental school was, the Bakke case all the way back in 1978. And so this is not new, but it's very depressing because there have been so many studies that have shown that, when you have doctors from different backgrounds, they end up giving better care to people from, a wider range of backgrounds as well. And I didn't want to make a film where we just made arguments about it because it's very clear to me that the anti-DEI mood that's just taken over the country now is going to make that problem worse. But I felt like, let's just see these students. If you follow these students and you see their work and you see their dedication and you see the challenges that they face, you will not doubt that these all of these students are just as qualified as anyone else. I think was the hope with making this film, was that you would understand that it's not, there's this misconception that DEI brings in unqualified candidates, and that's absolutely not true. DEI was made to level the playing field a little bit, to open the doors a little bit to other people who are going to excel in the field, but who haven't had the privileges, the private tutors, the private schools, the parents who are doctors already, all of these advantages that make it so that most medical schools are full of, students from quite privileged backgrounds who have, many of them have parents, at least one parent who's a doctor already.
Shauna, I mean, there's a scene in there with one of the students, and his mentor is an African-American male, and he says, the percentage of young Black men becoming doctors has improved, but incredibly, a very small amount.
When I went to medical school, there were 5 Black students.
Really?
Out of a class of 200.
Wow.
Yeah, so you have what, triple me maybe? But don't forget to pay it forward, because, pretty much, if you look at the WMC numbers, it's still, physician is really only 3% Black males of the entire, physician population in the United States.
When you were going through med school, were you conscious of that?
Yes, I think it's really evident once you walk on campus and you start meeting your peers. And it's Einstein, my class coming in was 183 people. And of that, if 20 was people of color, and that includes Black and Hispanic students, that's the fraction that it was. And it's just something that you just kind of know that it exists. Even like the doctors that we work with that are our professors, or even attendings we work with in a hospital, not many of them look like me or look like anybody in my family for the most part.
So tell me a little bit about what made you, right now I hear that you are pursuing radiology, right? Why radiology?
It's just something that I encountered on my 3rd year, but radiology is just something I just fell in love with. I love, I was a math person in college. I majored in math, and just looking at the images, I like the images. I like the pathology. And then I did a breast radiology rotation, which is pretty cool because I think people think of radiologists, they think of them just kind of being in a dark room, not doing much, not really interacting with patients, but that's really not the case. And you can make whatever you want of it. You could be in a room reading, or you could be more patient facing. You could be doing procedures. So I feel like I just had just the variety that I wanted in a career. And if my priorities change as I go older in a profession, I think I can move through the space in a way that kind of fits my life as I go on.
Asako, there's a powerful moment in the film where really the students are coming in at kind of their first day of cadaver lab.
You never know who's going to be triggered. It's really interesting process. We want to respect the fact that if you don't feel well, just get out of here, okay? We'll come check on you, okay? All right. So
as a filmmaker, how did you choose which moments? What were the things that you were looking for? Because I'm sure you had a lot of hours of video that we didn't see.
Yes, there was definitely a lot of hours. I will say, just sort of the complication of shooting in any medical setting is there's a lot of permissions you have to get. Like every time you see a patient, people were contacted ahead of time. They had to sign HIPAA releases as well as appearance releases. It was quite complicated. So we had a lot with our students outside of patient settings. But in terms of just getting to know the students, it was important to sort of show these different aspects of it. The challenge of how much work there is, the realization that no matter how well you ace your tests, if you don't know how to talk to a patient, you're not going to necessarily be a good doctor. And if you are worried about yourself academically, you might actually, discover that your skills making people feel at ease are going to be the ones that really make a difference.
Shauna, you and the other sort of main character, you kind of have this fork in the road, and very sort of justifiably so. She wants to stay in the Bronx, and she wants to match with a hospital, and she does it, in the Bronx. And you're like, I'm ready to see the rest of the world, right? And you are now at Duke. What was the motivating factor for you to kind of spread your wings?
Yeah, it was definitely a decision that was not taken lightly. It's something I always saw myself as a doctor and practice in New York and helping my community. But I think once my brother was killed, like right before starting med school, I feel like I gave like New York enough of my energy and time, and didn't want my kids to kind of grow up in the same neighborhoods and environments, even if I was to become a doctor and be able to move out of different neighborhoods within New York City. I feel like it's still so accessible. And then my family, like history is so accessible. And I just feel like it was time for me to kind of move into a different space in my life. And I thought I kind of landed at North Carolina because I'm like, it's still far enough south where the weather's nicer. And then I'll still have still close enough that it's a quick flight or it's drivable back home to New York City where most of my family lives. So I think I gave New York a lot of my time and emotion and energy. And I think I don't want my kids to have to even experience it or even know of it for the most part.
Yeah. Not to mention, it's a very good program that you're in. So congratulations for that.
Yes,
right?
for sure.
I think it's a privilege to be a doctor. And I think it's even more a privilege to be a Black doctor. I think a lot of people from my background don't see medicine as an option. They probably don't see people that look like them in those spaces, and it can be very daunting for them. And I think I've been very fortunate having people help me kind of find a way to succeed.
Sako, you kind of weave these kind of personal narratives into the story a little bit. Why did you feel that was important for us to kind of get to know the characters' backstories, get to know kind of them and their families? Because we have multiple scenes of that.
I think a lot of people feel alienated from the medical system for a lot of reasons. And a lot of it has to do with the insurance and the way that, when something terrible happens to a family member, I had one of my daughters was hit by a car, and the first way I knew about it was the hospital called asking for the insurance. And so there's a lot of ways that you blame the doctors as a patient. You think the doctor is just there to make money, that they don't care about you, that they're wasting your time. And just the hoops that you have to jump through to get things covered and all of that. It's easy to not see that the doctors come to this profession, that it's actually an incredible devotion to caring for others that motivates them. And one of the ways I felt like you really could feel it was when you saw them outside of class, outside of those medical settings, that you could feel that this is a person that their whole life has brought them to this point, that they're willing to make these sacrifices to do this incredibly hard work. Yeah. And it's not like doing other kinds of jobs. I mean, it is a job where you are committing yourself. That's why it's called the calling. And so I think that for those of us who aren't doctors, who are just in the large patient community, it was a way to understand who are the doctors that are caring for us, and why it matters. Which understanding that they can come from all kinds of backgrounds and be really a great doctor.
So, Sako, what's the reception been since the film's been out?
It's been great. I mean, I have been surprised at how, moved people are. I mean, of course, doctors are thrilled by it. Interestingly, I just came back yesterday from a film festival in Cuba where there were Cuban medical students and a faculty member from the medical school there who, they were thrilled. They loved seeing it because they have a lot of complaints about the way their medical system works. But, they have single payer and they're very under-resourced, but medical education is free and they're known to have very good doctors. So it was just fascinating for them to see that, something that they kind of take for granted, that if you want to be a doctor, you can just go for free. To see the hoops that these students were jumping through because they were so committed to caring for patients, and that was something, they were really moved by. I mean, there were tears.
Yeah. Shauna, it comes as a postscript in the film, but just really after you graduate is this unbelievable philanthropic gift. The tuition will now be free at Einstein for every medical student coming in. You did not benefit from that. But what is the change that you see possible?
Yes. So I do hope that the change allows for students like me to now be able to not worry about the financial burden of medical school. And Einstein has a great mission for medical school. And I think that mission allowed me as a student to get accepted into Einstein. And I just would love for that mission to keep them true to that value of making a help in a diverse medical system. I know we're in the times where, like Asako was saying, that DEI is under attack, and people missions statements are changing a little bit to maintain their federal funding. But I do hope that this is something that they still allow them to be true to their character and their mission, and admit students like me who wouldn't have a chance otherwise to get into medical schools.
Asako, we're having a conversation on the day that these students match, and you captured that for this particular class and this group of students that you were following. So what was that like?
I mean, it was exciting, and it was also, for my core crew who had been, bothering these students for an entire year. We were just as emotional. We were crying. We saw each other. Like I saw, the associate producer, the cameraman. There were like tears everywhere. Everyone was like blowing their noses because we were so excited. And I will say, when I cast the two sort of main fourth year students that we followed that are the core of the film, I met them when they were in their third year, and we sort of imagined following them over this year. I could never have predicted that they would both get their top choice residency, because not everyone does. I just want to be sure that people understand that. The fact that they get the ones that they wanted the most and that they told me repeatedly they wanted the most was kind of amazing.
Yeah. It was really a wonderful kind of crescendo to the film, just emotionally as well as just kind of as a narrative arc. But so congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Filmmaker Asako Gladjo and Dr. Shauna Finizzi, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, the New Yorker magazine turns 100, and it is celebrating in style with a new Netflix documentary that takes us behind the scenes, which follows staff as they produce the anniversary issue. David Remnick is the New Yorker's longtime editor, and he's joining Walter Isaacson to reflect on its precarious beginning to its significance today.
Thank you, Christian, and David Remnick. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Walter.
For the 100th anniversary of the New Yorker, you had Netflix come do a documentary on you putting together the 100th anniversary issue. And one of the things in the show is they asked celebrities to say little vignettes about when was the first time you encountered the New Yorker. Let us show the clip, and then I'm going to ask you that question.
We actually didn't have very much money, but we did have a New Yorker subscription.
I think the first time I heard about the New Yorker was on Seinfeld. They had a great episode where Elaine did not understand one of the cartoon captions.
I grew up in New Jersey and was very kind of like starry-eyed about all things New York. The first time I ever heard of the New Yorker and understood it to be this important magazine was in an episode of the animated show The Critic. Bravo, Mrs. S. And I remember just thinking, oh, that's the New Yorker. It's this important thing.
I don't know how I knew about it, but it's just there. It's just one of those institutions. It's like saying, when did you first hear about the Statue of Liberty?
So let me ask you, when did you first encounter the New Yorker?
In my father's office. My father was a dentist in suburban New Jersey, had a very small practice, and on Saturdays and Sundays, it was obviously closed, and I'd go down and read Highlights magazine and Time magazine and Life and Look, and I encountered this thing that I didn't understand very readily. There was a magazine that had drawings on the cover and gag cartoons, and in those days, lots of advertisements, and I didn't quite get it, Walter, to be honest with you. And even when I was a teenager, my favorite magazines were the infinitely cooler Rolling Stone, and I liked the Village Voice a lot. Esquire was where this was all happening. I got to the New Yorker and got to understand it and get a feel for it when I had a teacher in college who wrote for the New Yorker.
And that would be, of course, John McPhee, right?
That's right. John McPhee, who these days is 93, and we worked together at the New Yorker, and, he even made me into one of his fishing buddies. Life works in strange ways.
And you call the magazine a miracle. Why is that?
I think it's a miracle. First of all, most publications, if they're lucky, have a moment in time when they're important, or they catch the zeitgeist in some way. To be on the cover of Time magazine, I needn't tell you, at a certain period in American history was an astonishing thing. Life magazine had a moment because of its visual nature that preceded television, but when TV came along, life was eclipsed. So to have something in newspapers, obviously the New York Times has this, so we're celebrating a centenary year and celebrating some of the things that have been published in the past, but a lot of time has been spent thinking about what's going to be ahead for us.
You've only had 5 editors in those 100 years. Totally amazing. And I think my first encounter with the New Yorker, believe it or not, is I had a favorite book my father had called The Years with Ross by James Thurber. And it talked about Harold Ross and how his personality imprinted the DNA of the New Yorker. Tell me about that founding editor.
Well, Harold Ross was a newspaperman from out west. Like all great New Yorkers, he's somebody who made his way here.
And worked on the item in New Orleans.
That's right. And I think he bounced around. He must have been in a newspaper every 6 months. He really bounced around a lot in an old style. But he came to New York and he had ideas for all kinds of things, shipping news. And then there was this one idea to have a kind of funny cosmopolitan news magazine. And mainly comic, Walter, at first, mainly comic. And he got a family, the Fleischman family, that made money in yeast to put a few dollars behind this cockamamie idea. And at first it was a big flop. It was not good. And it was a financial failure as well. And they almost shut the thing down. And Harold Ross, who was a bit of a card player and he was familiar with the bottle occasionally, in an all-night poker game, nearly lost the whole thing. So it's a miracle that it lasted to 1926, much less 2025.
He said this magazine wasn't for the little old lady from Dubuque.
Yeah.
I think I was reading in The Years with Ross, they had a cartoon proposed where they had to have Harold Ross go apologize to his aunt from Dubuque at a hotel. Why? What did he mean by that? And is that still what the magazine's about?
I think he meant that he wanted that magazine to be for a very particular community. It was it wasn't even, the community didn't even extend to the Brooklyn or the Bronx. It was a very Manhattan jazz age idea meant to be a very small publication. It's since expanded. It's expanded in its seriousness and its reporting and its length and its ambitions. I don't think Harold Ross imagined a magazine that would break the Abu Ghraib scandal or Hiroshima by John Hersey. That came infinitely later. By the way, I just wanted on the record that I'm happy to have anyone in Dubuque reading The New Yorker. It's for whoever has eyes to see and read. So I'm much my attitude about that, I don't share with Harold Ross.
Harold Ross is succeeded by his deputy for many, many years, William Shawn, Mr. Shawn to everybody. And he did not seem to have a great sense of humor, but he had a feel for the long form, right?
He did. I mean, he was Ross's deputy for a long time. And just as Catherine Angel, who became Catherine White, introduced really top-level fiction to The New Yorker, William Shawn played an instrumental role in bringing deep reporting to The New Yorker. The apotheosis of this was John Hersey's piece about Hiroshima, Rachel Carson on pesticides, and James Baldwin on race, and so on. So it also shows you that a magazine, a publication, really any imaginative process that's not just individual, is a collection of intelligences that come together. And I think a good editor is not somebody that believes that he or she has the answer to everything and the only person who's generating ideas.
You mentioned John Hersey's Hiroshima. And I was at the New York Public Library. That's what I do for fun. And that's where your archives are. And they have a display, I'm sure you know, of all the archives. And I saw on the wall the most amazing letter. I actually took a photograph of it. And it says, "Dear Bill, do you think you could tolerate 4 parts on Hiroshima? I can't say of my material on the bombing that it's wonderful, but it is sobering, moving, and newsy." Yeah. First of all, I can't imagine anybody calling Mr. Shawn Dear Bill, but also the rest of that letter, that was an amazing leap.
It was at that time, and it's a leap that's since been taken innumerable times. You know, very often a reporter will come back from wherever he or she has been, and they have a story to tell that is beyond the imagining of any editor or even, the current media. In his case, he had witnessed something that had not been publicized at all, except in the most abstract terms. The atomic age had begun, but the human cost of it on the ground had not been seen in the United States. So we are at a point now, Walter, where still foreign journalists are not allowed into Gaza. And yet at the same time, we've seen a lot of innumerable images because of, for all the reasons we know, because of the phone and God bless them, journalists in Gaza, and bless the memory of those who have been so horribly killed. That was a different world. That was not a world of social media and videos on your phone. And Percy brought that human news to the United States, and it made international news. It had incredible resonance.
In this Netflix documentary, Tina Brown, your predecessor, plays a big role and talked about having to really kind of dust it off and sweep out some of the cobwebs. Tell me what she did.
Well, you know, you want to be careful at any given moment in time that you're not just admired, but actually read. You're right. And I think there comes a time in the life of any long-standing publication where you can fall into habits or self-satisfaction. There's no question that the New Yorker was publishing terrific things during late Sean and during Bob Gottlieb's reign, but Tina had an outsider sense of how to shake things up. We're not the same people. I don't know that we'd make absolutely every editorial decision the same. Of course not. But I work for her as a writer, and I was very much behind this idea of shaking things up. And I'll be perfectly honest, she made my life a lot easier coming in.
And so when you came in, she made your life easier maybe by shaking things up. What did you feel you had to change, and what's your mark you're putting on it?
Well, I it's been 27 years, Walter, to be honest, and I might be the worst judge of whatever my term is, because I'm sort of in the thick of it in the way you don't always see backwards very well when you're looking forward all the time. But certainly one of them has to be, how did the New Yorker accommodate to the modern media age? How did it take on the internet and audio and video? Just the different velocity, and how do we exist in the world? What is our voice in it? That's all taken a lot of attention and a lot of work.
One of the tensions I saw in that Netflix thing, it was about, being very modern, but also being very traditional. And as one of your writers talking about having to quote somebody as saying, elite mother something or other.
But with the accent aigu over
and so he said, yes, they actually ran the word, but they maybe put the accent aigu on the elite.
Yeah, this is Andrew Moran's, and he says maybe by putting that accent, it proves their case that we are such, that phrase.
One of the most iconic aspects of the New Yorker is the magazine's cover, of course. And I wanted to do a clip, we'll see, of the arts editor, longtime arts editor, right? Francois Mouly, is that how you say your name?
Yeah, Francois Mouly.
Discussing what goes into deciding the cover. So here, let's look at this clip.
Sure.
Until you have the cover, you don't know what the personality of the issue is. It's not something that you can just slap on at the last minute. A cover needs to speak to the moment, but also be a timeless piece of art that should be able to be framed and put on a wall. Frankly, chasing that week after week keeps me up with anxiety even after 30 years.
What are your elements where you say, yes, that's the one?
Well, it has to work the way a grenade works, right? You can't, if you have to explain it for 5 minutes what's going on, or you have to have explanations about why this may or may not be good, it doesn't work. It has to work immediately. It has to work immediately. Now, people interpret a joke or an image in different ways, and that's fine. In fact, it's great. But if you're sort of puzzling over it, as if it were an obscure Escher drawing or something like that doesn't quite work, then there's a problem. And so Francoise and it's basically a two-person operation. She's generating ideas all the time and sketches, and then she comes to me and we discuss what we like and what we don't like. And once in a while, if I'm on the fence, I'll take that sketch around the office to, a few people that I trust, or will put pressure on my presumptions, and we'll make a decision.
One of the things that happens in this documentary is you're always walking the halls, being with people in the office, the meetings. Yeah. How important is it in this day and age to be back in the office, so to speak?
Look, I know there's lots of discussion about that in lots of workplaces, including my own, but I think it's important. I think it's okay that there's some more greater flexibility than there was pre-pandemic, but the act of being in the same room with somebody, of bumping into people and having casual conversations that you didn't expect to have, is infinitely better than the business of, texting someone, can we talk later? And it's just not as spontaneous, or nor is it as productive. This is a collaborative piece of work. Writing is not. Writing is some poor soul all alone in her office or room, wherever it is, trying to apply mind to the matter of what's in front of them. That's hard work. But in terms of the making of a publication, the online version daily, the weekly version, what the mix is of things, the ideas that we will be visiting 6 months or a year from now, that to me really benefits by being in rooms together with other human beings. It's amazing to think that this is under such challenge, but I think time is going to bear that out.
There aren't that many places that do this kind of super labor-intensive, super confronting journalism. I mean, they're not activists, but they are fearless when the facts support it.
One of my favorite things in The New Yorker, of course, is Talk of the Town, and it's evolved. And one of the great writers was E.B. White, who mastered that art. And my favorite is something he wrote, which is, we received a letter from the Writers' War Board the other day asking for a statement on the meaning of democracy. Yeah. Now, it's a beautiful piece he writes, very sort of dry and clever, but it's also about democracy, and that still seems to be one of the causes of The New Yorker.
It absolutely is. And I'm glad you brought that up because look, I watch your show, and I think you would say the same of your program, is that democracy, to say the very, very least, is under great challenge now. It's under great challenge from, above all, the President of the United States. And that's not just something to say, that's something to do rigorous journalism about, fair-minded, rigorous, accurate journalism. But democratic institutions are, including your own, by the way, public television, are under assault. And we are duty-bound as a democratic institution ourselves to stand up for it and do the work that we're supposed to be doing at the highest level, tirelessly, and without compromise. And when I say without compromise, I don't mean once, just kind of in some sort of vitriolic way, but to do the work of reporting. I was on a panel about journalism the other day, and I looked around and I realized that the lion's share of people at the table were not anybody that had taken out a notebook in 10 years. They had things to say. They were commentators. They were talking heads. They were comedians. But at the heart of this enterprise of journalism is reporting, finding out what is true, what is hidden, and bringing it to light, and applying the real standards of truth as best you can in a given time. Knowing all the while you will fail at times. You will fail. And we should be honest about our failures as well. But that is at the center of our work, too. We're not the only ones, to be sure, not even remotely. But that's my, if that sounds sanctimonious, then I don't really care.
David Remnick, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.
Now, it was a proposal in President Trump's first term, but now he's taking steps to make it a reality. Will a new executive order spell the end of the Department of Education? Well, as a member of the House Education Committee and a former public school teacher herself, Democratic Congresswoman Jahana Hayes is doing everything she can to protect the millions of students who rely on the department's programs. She was recently among a group of lawmakers who were denied entry into the DOE by armed security guards. And now she's joining Michelle Martin to sound the alarm on the consequences of Trump's plans.
Thanks, Christiane. Congresswoman Jahana Hayes, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thank you so much for having me.
We've talked with you a number of times on this program, beginning when you were National Teacher of the Year. You were a teacher for 15 years. So it's logical that we would come to you when the whole, the future of the Department of Education seems to be in play. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is, what do you understand about the Trump administration's goal for the Department of Education?
I think the challenge and the reason no one has an answer to that question is because they are circumventing all procedure, not coming before Congress, not laying out a plan, not helping the American people to understand what the future of public education looks like for them. And that is a problem. I mean, outside of the fact that Congress is a co-equal branch and we have oversight responsibilities, the fact that one person can unilaterally just reform or change or reimagine the future of public education in this country with no input from Congress, from experts in the field, is dangerous.
First, candidate Trump, now President Trump, again, has said he wants to close the Department of Education. That's actually not a new position for a Republican president to take. Republicans have, many of them, have criticized the Department of Education since its founding. What do you understand about their chief objection to the department, other than the fact that, it was founded under President Jimmy Carter at the request of the teachers' unions?
I don't really understand their objection, but it's very clear to me that they don't have a full appreciation for what the department does. Many of the concerns that I've heard about curriculum or instruction or even the choice of instructional materials are not things that are handled primarily by the Department of Education. What the department does handle is civil rights complaints, discrimination, making sure teacher preparation is done properly, special education, the 7 million children who receive services through IDEA and have an IEP in place. The department oversees things like that. So many of the objections that I hear coming from my colleagues are things that are handled at the state and local level by boards of education. I think what they also fail to give an answer for is IDEA, which I just talked about, which is the program that covers students with disabilities or special needs. That's a legal requirement. So even absent the department or pulling back the funding, states and local communities will still be obligated to provide those services. And what they're not sharing with people is how will these things be paid for? Who will oversee implementation of them? Who will make sure that these things are done properly? There really is no plan. I think that is part of the challenge. And for the pennies that we're talking about, because these are pennies when we're talking about the Department of Education. This is a department that has not had full investments since it was created. And the test scores reflect that. But the answer is not to take a hammer to it and tear everything down. It's to say, what do we need to do to make sure that students have access to every opportunity that they should have? And what this department should be doing, this administration should be doing, is looking at all of the other factors that impede learning. Things like kids coming to school hungry, not having safe and secure housing, gun violence, all of the things that make kids absent or truant from school, healthcare, all of those things. If you really want to have an honest conversation about making sure our kids have every opportunity for education, we would be talking about those things and not stripping resources from the communities that need them the most.
I know you and a number of other congresspersons actually went to the Department of Education building in Washington and tried to gain access to, presumably to talk to people about what's going on there. You were refused entry. But what do you understand just from what your sources of the department are telling you about what steps the Trump administration has taken so far in pursuit of its stated desire to shut it down?
Well, my understanding is that the actions that they're taking are illegal. The Department of Education, although Jimmy Carter was the one who proposed it, was created by an act of Congress. So it can only be dismantled by an act of Congress. I think it's very important to note that not only was I and members of Congress denied access to the public access entrance of the Department of Education building, but the Department of Homeland Security had officers there waiting for us and not allowing us to enter. So this is really an attack on the co-equal branches of government, on our oversight responsibilities. But beyond that, the president has the right to say, I'm not happy with this department and I want it to change. But there's a process by which that happens. And you come to Congress, you have oversight hearings, you lay out the facts, you present the data and the information to the American people, and then you present a plan for changes. This, I mean, we've seen it at other agencies across the board where they're firing people unilaterally and then having to call them back, where they're shutting down arms of departments and then realizing that these are the people that handle our most important or specific areas. I argue that our children are just that important, that they're just that specific, that we don't get a do-over. We don't get to shut down programs that they need right now and then revisit them in a few months when we find out what's in its place or what hasn't been replaced is not working. And this department, this agency, President Trump and Elon Musk, who appears to be making all the decisions, really don't have an understanding for the communities and the children that are going to be impacted by these harsh decisions. And it feels like they just don't care.
You know, what's interesting is that we know, for example, from reporting, a number of news outlets have reported that people from the Office of Civil Rights, for example, have been fired. We know, for example, that people in the Office of Civil Rights specifically have been told not to take on new cases, not to acknowledge any of the cases that are pending, a number of which have to do with complaints of discrimination around access for students with disabilities. Does that comport with what you've been told about what's going on at the department?
Yes, absolutely. This department is being very selective about what they prioritize. I mean, right here in Connecticut, one of our premier institutions for training teachers, Sacred Heart University, lost almost a $3.5 million grant, which would have trained 80 special education teachers that would have gone into Title I school districts where they are so sorely needed. That doesn't seem to be a priority of this administration. And that funding was rescinded because of what they call DEI initiatives. Well, diversity, equity, and inclusion does include students with special needs. It does include students from different religious backgrounds. And any effective teacher needs to have every tool available to them in their toolkit to go into a community and a school like that and be able to teach. This department is being incredibly selective. One of the first executive orders by this president was on trans athletes in K-12 education. Mm-hmm. They're focusing on these things that affect such a small part of the population. There's less than 3% of students in the entire United States who identify as trans in our K-12 public education system, but this has been a priority.
I was asking you about workers in the department being fired summarily, many of them saying that they don't know why.
I've gotten email and text from people that I know at the department that they were dismissed without cause. They don't know why, terminated effective immediately. That's not how you implement reforms in an organization. You first have to learn what it is people do and make a decision on if that job is important, not just fire everybody. We are going to lose so much institutional knowledge and talent from the Department of Education because people are just being fired unilaterally. And I'm hearing about this from people in every part of that agency. One of the things that I've seen is that in order to usurp the power of Congress, it's just like a rolling blackout where funding is rescinded, where people are being fired, where arms of the department are being shut down. So it's not just the lights are going off like they did at USAID, but it's a rolling blackout where one by one, people are let go, funding is rescinded, there's a pause on different things, and before we know it, we're going to blink and say, what happened to the Department of Education? And I think that's why myself and so many other members of Congress have been so vocal right now, so that the American public knows what's happening and is paying attention.
Congresswoman, you know, the Trump administration says that the department hasn't proven its case. If you compare student achievement in the United States with, say, our peer competitors around the world, you know, reading proficiency is not at the highest level. Math proficiency is not at the highest level. And we obviously know that the COVID crisis made an impact, but some of these numbers were falling before that.
Right.
And so when you look at that, many people say, well, if the department isn't getting the job done, maybe it's time to try something else. What do you say to that?
So we've just seen our NAEP scores, and the department collects this information, but every state has their own Department of Education. So the way they're teaching these standards is going to vary from state to state. I would argue that in a lot of our states that perform really low, many of our red states, they haven't made the investments in public education that some of our partners around the world have. And then even in different countries where we're talking about the quality of education is much higher, they have things like universal health care, universal child care, birth to 3 initiatives. Families have paid family leave so that when their children are sick, they can be home with them. So a lot of the barriers that you face as a public education teacher, we can't just talk about the outcome without looking at all of the barriers to success that students come to school with. So I would welcome a conversation about how we improve the future of public education, but it has to include all of those things, because absent those things, we're not comparing apples to apples.
And what about the argument that giving the states more autonomy would at least make parents feel more invested in their local schools? I mean, you can't deny the fact that there is a lot of dissatisfaction with public schools. That's one of the reasons there's been a charter school movement, for example. There's been this push to kind of use public resources to support more privatized sort of educational structures. What do you say to that?
Parents need to understand exactly what the department does, because when you talk about local autonomy, local school districts are the ones who run our schools, local boards of education, state boards of education. So the problem is also a local problem. In our high poverty areas that rely on tax dollars to run their schools, I'm in the state of Connecticut where we have huge equity gaps. I have exclusive boarding schools in my district, some of the highest performing public schools, and also some of the lowest performing public schools. But if we base it on a system by which we're only pulling from local tax dollars, and you have a community that's already depressed, then their school system is not going to be as good as maybe the suburban one a couple miles down the road. My argument is that 49 million children rely on public education. About 1 million children take advantage of private charter school vouchers. We don't have 49 million private charter school slots, and education should not be a for-profit endeavor. So we want to look at our structure of education, how we're making those investments, but to just say parents are dissatisfied, we have to take it a step further to say, and what are you dissatisfied with? Because most of the autonomy over that decision making is done at the local level. The Department of Education doesn't go in and tell a local school how to operate. It doesn't tell them what they have to do. It makes sure that federal civil rights law is followed and that there are certain things that are adhered to, but most of those decisions are already made at the local level.
I guess the real question is, do the Democrats have an argument around this that both is getting through and that makes sense to the American people?
I think it's going to be about more than just the Democrats. It's going to be about everyone stepping in, and parents speaking up, and teachers and local community leaders. It's going to take all of the people who care about this topic really amplifying their voices, talking to people in their community, paying attention to not only what members of Congress are saying, but how people are voting on these issues. The Democratic Party alone or elected leaders are not going to be the ones who are going to be able to fix this by themselves. It's going to take everyone who literally has a kid in these schools, cares about the future of public education, wants to know how their tax dollars are being spent, wants some accountability for an unelected billionaire making all of these unilateral choices right now that are going to dramatically and negatively impact the lives of people and communities. I mean, all of this was laid out in Project 2025, and we see literally page by page everything coming into reality. But this is not something that 435 members of Congress are going to amplify on their own. It's going to be where the American people learn that, wait a minute, this is the teacher at my school, or this is the after school or the before school program that my child attends. This is the summer program in my community that is funded through the federal government. It's going to take for all of those people, and they're everywhere, in rural communities, in urban communities, in suburban communities, to say, wait a minute, I didn't vote for all of this.
Okay, but to that end, though, you mentioned Project 2025, which was a project by sort of an outside, interest group that during the campaign, then candidate Trump disavowed it, but he has now, appointed or selected one of the authors of Project 2025, for example, Russell Vought, to be the head of the Office of Management and Budget. It's a very influential position. Their argument is that people did vote for it. They knew exactly what the game plan was. It was laid out in this document. It was not a secret. That's what people voted for. So they are, in fact, proceeding with the mandate that they say they have. What do you say to that?
Well, I think it goes back to your previous question. A lot of people, I don't think, truly understood, okay, wait, this is going to affect me. I think people were offered the idea of getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse in government. But when you start to boil it down and say, wait a minute, this is my Medicare, this is my Social Security, this is the school in my community. And one of my frustrations with this work is, I remember when I first got elected, people said, if you're explaining, you're losing. And we have to meet people where they are. Not everybody understands these departments in and out. Not everybody understands. I just had to tell people within the Democratic caucus that the Department of Education does not oversee Head Start. They didn't realize that. I said, no, that's the Department of Health and Human Services. So we really have to explain to the American people, this is what that means. This is, it looks like a line item in the budget, but this is what it looks like in your community. And I think that the American people are smart enough to know that there's a difference between rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse and cutting programs that are essential to their schools and their communities. And I think we just have to take the case to the American people and explain to them in specificity, down to the school and the program that will be affected, so that people truly understand there's a difference between voting for cuts to the federal debt or cuts to the federal workforce or the federal budget and what they get in their community. But again, all of that is happening at the same time my Republican colleagues are proposing additional tax cuts to the wealthiest individuals. So, I mean, this argument is flawed because it's not to help the American people. It's to shift money from the people who need it most to wealthy billionaires and elites.
Congresswoman Jahana Hayes, thank you so much for talking with us once again.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Well, we turn now to an issue that's been puzzling governments, investors, and ordinary people alike. The potential benefits of artificial intelligence weighed against the risks. Our next guest, Reid Hoffman, co-founder of LinkedIn, believes that the list of benefits is long. He joined Walter Isaacson to talk about the new book he co-authored, Super Agency.
Thank you, Bianna and Reid Hoffman. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here.
Man, you've been in the forefront of everything in the digital revolution, from LinkedIn to PayPal, and now, of course, artificial intelligence. You've got a new book called Super Agency. It's very optimistic about AI. But let me start with the title and with the word agency. Let's leave aside super agency for a minute, just agency. When we humans use it, it means we have a free will to make a plan and take an action. Is that what you mean here? And can computers do that?
Well, I'm not saying that computers can do that. This is actually a book about human agency, both individual and societal, hence the kind of super agency and superpowers. But by the way, the philosophers might dispute different definitions of whether or not it's agency and free will, but it is agency as expressions of our fundamental kind of humanity and how we organize our lives and connect with each other. And the thesis around super agency is that AI, like other general purpose technologies in our history, will help us do that.
Right. And what you talk about in the book is the notion that working with the symbiosis between the machines and ourselves will empower us more. Explain why you think we get empowered more when our machines are doing more and more things.
Well, I mean, for example, take cars as a history, which, by the way, they did have a similar discussion about whether or not to destroy human society, change patterns of human interaction, et cetera. And cars actually give you agency. They give you superpowers, the ability to go faster, further distances, et cetera. And by the way, you get super agency with cars, because not only do you get that superpower, but other people do too. A doctor might be able to come visit you versus you having to try to get to the doctor. And computers, I think, and AI will do the same thing.
When you say that it'll be safe and will respond to our needs, let me quote a sentence where you say, we're going to pursue a future in which billions of people around the world get equitable hands-on access to experiment with these technologies. First of all, let me ask you, why is that important?
Well, it's important in part because part of how we get, just think about, for example, Tim Cook's iPhone is the same one that the cab driver and the Uber driver is using. And so it's the fact when you get technologies designed for hundreds of millions of people, billions of people, and they're engaged with them, then we're all being elevated and our society itself is getting super agency together. And so that inclusion helps us direct it in ways that are better, not just for individuals, but also for society.
You talk about a cognitive industrial revolution. And I love looking at history of all the various agricultural and industrial revolutions compared to this one to the previous revolutions we've had driven by technology.
Well, part of the reason I call it a cognitive industrial revolution is I want both the kind of the upside to be well understood, which is nothing of our society, the way we exist, middle class, education, medicine, this very technology that you and I are talking on today exists without the Industrial Revolution. So the outcome, the targeted outcome can be amazing and should be amazing. But it's also, we have to navigate the transitions, because the transitions, like the transition into the Industrial Revolution, necessitated a lot of kind of difficult adjustments within human society. We needed child labor laws, we needed, work weeks, we needed a whole bunch of other things in order to make that work. And I anticipate we're going to have similar transition issues. And so we need to navigate those, hopefully, having learned, with more humanity and more grace than earlier transitions.
Well, tell me about some of the transition rules that you think are necessary for AI.
Well, so it is the fact that, like, people say, oh, it's going to be a whole bunch of job replacement. And there will be some job replacement. Take, for example, customer service, where a human is basically trying to be a robot, following a script. AI will do that much better. But even a lot of other jobs will be transformed. So when you previously needed these 20 skills, you now need only, call it, 8 of those skills and then 5 more in order to do the job. Like if you're a graphic designer, your ability to do things fine-tuned with your graphic dexterity, manual dexterity is very important. Now, visual thinking is still important, but the manual dexterity may be less important, and that's kind of a job transition. So we need AIs. The thing I would be asking for from the companies, from government, is AIs that help people with these transitions. Which few skills they need to pick up. Is they're going to still be doing this job, which will be a human with an AI replacing a human, being the same human doing that, or helping you find other jobs, helping you learn other jobs, helping you do other jobs. And we want AIs helping us with all that.
Yeah, when you talk about it, the role seems even grander than just helping us with our jobs, because I'm going to read you a sentence from the book. You say, every new technology we've invented, from languages to books, you talked about the printing press, to the mobile phone, has defined, redefined, deepened, and expanded what it means to be human. So tell me how this will expand what it means to be human.
Well, so part of it is we are actually more Homo techne than Homo sapiens. We evolve through our technology. Our genetics are very much basically the same over the last 4,000 years, which is kind of the recorded history of human civilization. And yet the way that I can see literally through glasses, etc. AI is going to be doing the same thing. It's going to be saying, hey, you want to learn something, you want to know something, you want to navigate the world. We call AI an informational GPS. And so just like you use GPS to navigate like a new city that you're going to, all information spaces, medical, work, education, creative, can be amplified with this information GPS. And that's the kind of, that then becomes a new part of what it is to be human, because we have that in helping us with our navigation, just as our smartphones and a map does today.
One of the things you talk about as part of your subtitle is we should talk about what could go right. I know you talk about medicine, you've been involved with cancer research. Tell me the big things that can go right with this.
Well, so, as you were gesturing at, Manas, a company that I co-founded with Siddhartha Mukherjee, trying to cure cancer with AI accelerations and drug discovery. But even more immediate, like line of sight, not building new things, is a medical assistant 24/7 that can be in every pocket. You have a concern about yourself, your child, your sibling, your parent. You can get an answer. A tutor on every subject for every age, a legal assistant. You're like, well, I can't afford a lawyer and I'm trying to figure out this rental contract. Well, actually, in fact, AIs, ChatGPT, Copilot, etc., can help you with that today. And so those are all ways that your life gets kind of magnified. And of course, it'll end up being even more things than these things that we can see today. Part of new general purpose technologies is that they create new things that we didn't even imagine was possible. And that's part of course, the excitement of, being an inventor and an investor in these things.
Give me an example of something we probably aren't imagining that you think might happen.
Well, okay, this might be a little wonkish for our audience, but like, for example, one of the reasons why that all of these frontier labs are building coding assistants is not just to make engineers more efficient. Yes, that is. But like now you're going to have co-pilots that can be a software engineer for all of us. So for example, if I said, hey, I want to create a new kind of game that I can play with my friends, and I have this idea of something that I could possibly do, I will then go create that game, and I can have my AI software engineer help create it for me. And that's just like one example of lots. It could be doing research. It could be, figuring out how I want to have a home app to coordinate with my family. All of those things we are now all going to have a software agent co-pilot within a relatively small number of years.
You talk about super agency, and you say that in this book that AI will enhance human agency. But so much of what's happened with social media recently and with digital revolution in general seems to have reduced our agency in some ways. It's made it harder for us to be in control of our lives. Explain that and what can be done.
Part of what we're trying to advocate for in the book and kind of how technologists build things, what are the things we should want or things that increase our agency. Part of it is that to say, well, imagine you had an agent that was on your side and you're reading something and was for you and was essentially enabling you. And you read something and you say, I'm not sure that's quite right. And then the agent can say, well, here are three things that you might consider as interesting sources to figure this out. Or hey, you're believing this thing that you're reading or you're seeing. Here's some cross things to check. Like, for example, one of the things that we're already seeing with AI is like cyber criminal phishing. So you can get a phone call that's trying to persuade you that it's your brother, sister, child, partner, etc., and start saying, hey, send money to here. Well, you also will have an agent that says, oh, hey, this sounds like this could be something that's not good for you. Why don't you ask something about what only the two of you know in order to make sure and can be part of the protection? And this is what we're essentially building to as we go through these transitions to the other side.
And how will AI then help us with disinformation in general? The type of disinformation that's gotten very controversial now, but seems to be undermining our democracy.
Well, as you know, this is a deeply political topic. I mean, what counts as misinformation? What counts as disinformation? There's a lot of different views on, and coming to a coherent set of views on that as kind of the bulk of America is actually very difficult. Now, that being said, I think there's a lot of ways that these agents can actually, in fact, kind of be on our side, helping like fact check and do other kinds of things. And so take, for example, you're reading some information on some media site or social media site that says, vaccines are known to be very dangerous and they like plant chips in you and they cause autism. And I say, well, actually, in fact, here's what a bunch of different scientific studies show. Here's what some of the people who challenge them say. And here's how you can inform yourself in a good way. And I think that's the kind of thing that we want these agents to be helping us with. And, part of it is if you have an agent that's kind of saying, hey, look out for me when I'm doing this. And I go, hey, I've seen this agent look out for me in various ways, like look out for me in terms of my health, look out for me in terms of making like financial decisions or reading my rental lease. Then it's like, oh, and then I trust it in telling me these things too. And that's part of my hope is that we get through as we work our way through the transition, that we actually have a more of a common based knowledge approach that we can then be finding more things of, here's how we can get to agreement and realize what this information possibly is.
Let me ask you about regulation. I just came back from Europe, and in Paris, they had the AI summit. And the previous AI summits, it had all been, how are we going to regulate this? Now, in Europe, they're totally panicked that Mistral, one of their AI companies that does Le Chat, which competes with ChatGPT, is going to be hindered because there'll be too much regulation. If there's a whole lot of competition and a whole lot of companies and a whole lot of countries from China to France to the U.S. doing it, how can we regulate it?
Well, I think that first off, we should try to keep the initial regulation very focused. It's like, how do we make sure that, criminals, terrorists, rogue states aren't doing things? How do we make sure that we don't make some critical large error, right, in terms of how this stuff works? Not how do we cover every single thing? Not how do we have it not, do something that might be like hallucination or a misstatement of some kind of fact or other kinds of things. Look, we can adjust those as we iterate and develop. And part of what I think is really good, I think the diversity of multiple things, I actually personally think that actually having the French, the British, the Germans, the Italians actually in this and helping shape that, I think helps it be for more humanity generally. It's any one culture only has its own lens. And as much as, of course, Walter, you and I love kind of a lot of the deep American values in American culture, part of the reason is because we learn from others, right, as well. It's one of the things that I think is our aspirational American values. And I think that's a good thing. And so I think regulation is possible. It should be done specifically, slowly, learning as we're doing it.
You've been a supporter of Democrats. I think you supported Kamala Harris, but so many of the tech bro friends you have from Silicon Valley have now been flocking to Washington, Elon Musk being very involved with the administration, but so many others. What caused this shift in the Silicon Valley mentality? And do you worry when you see an inauguration that has all tech bros sitting in front of the cabinet?
Well, I think there's two things. So one is, if I said any government, including the American, is deeply talking to the technology industry about how the future is, I would say that's good. And that includes our current administration and so on. Now, I think one of the reasons why a lot of technologists said, hey, we're going to work with the current administration is not just, of course, because it was, completely fairly and democratically elected, but also it's the, hey, you also believe that the technology industry is important about how we create the future jobs, the future industry, the future services that help us and become part of what we can export to the world. And that really matters. And if you have one party arguing that that's good and one party arguing that that's bad, the industry, the tech industry will will lean in some percentage to the party that argues that that's good.
You were also involved in the lawsuit against Trump. I think you helped fund E. Jean Carroll. And he's become very vindictive against even the law firms that have been involved. Do you worry about that revenge and vindictiveness, the bulliness that we sometimes see coming out of Washington?
Well, of course I do. I think it's only human and natural to do so. I mean, like when he removed Mark Milley's protection detail, a general who has put his whole life in service of the U.S. and engaged in conflict around the world, and who is a target of essentially our, like the opponents of America, like Iran, if he's willing to do that, what else is he willing to do? That's of course very deeply concerning.
I'm going to read you a sentence that really struck me in your book, which is, by maintaining our development lead, we're infusing AI technologies with democratic values and integrating these technologies across society in ways that bolster our economic power, our national security, and our ability to broadly project our global influence. Explain why you think it's important for the U.S. to maintain the lead while also infusing it with our values.
So technology shaped the world. And part of the reason why the, kind of Europeans had, global impact for centuries was they were the first developers and broad adopters of the Industrial Revolution. This is the cognitive Industrial Revolution. The same kind of thing is going to shape, like, what are the societies and industries that have power, and what are the things that kind of affect, in terms of the shape of technology, how we navigate the world, this kind of informational GPS. And so a system that says, hey, it's really important that individuals have autonomy, have agency, that we make decisions as a collective group together within kind of democratic processes is, I think, like some of the great things that America and other countries have brought to the world. And I think that's important that we continue to elaborate them. And the way we do that is by being on the forefront of this technology. And so, sometimes when I'm really trying to push this point home within a, kind of an American context, is we want AI to be American intelligence.
Reid Hoffman, thank you so much for joining us.
Walter, always a pleasure.